So the question is, they don't have the money and the price of housing is going up. And so that's the problem, right? So the question is, with the current income they have, how can we make housing accessible to them? And it could be rental. Maybe everybody cannot be a homeowner. Somebody mentioned that it was to be the goal that everybody will be a homeowner. We have kind of backed away from that. So we are looking at rental housing. Even rental housing now in cities like here, Boston, the rents are so high, who can afford it, right? So what do we do under a situation like that when you don't have enough income to get access to the housing?
That it's a systemic kind of notion that we really need to, if it's going to be sustainable, any housing thing, it's got to be that we've got to address the fundamentals, because the fundamentals are driving this market basis. And you guys are all much more aware of these global trends than I am. You are all experts in policy analysis. I'm a practitioner, and there are tons of obstacles. And each and every obstacle, when it comes to putting in a housing project like the one I'm doing, keeps jacking up the price and taking land off the table, or taking projects off the table. So I don't think this is going to be any one solution. I think all the ideas really might benefit from just classification of, hey, we got this problem, we got that problem, what's going on in that category. And so I liked your classification idea, Bish. We might be more broad still, but I think that it's not like there's any one sword that slices everything.
So, for example, in Vietnam, we looking at the problem why the supply side is going down, because of developers. They are more interested in higher like luxury house, because the profit margins of affordable housing is very thin, and in some case they cannot make profit. And the reason for that is because of one of the reasons, because the policy, there's a lot of paperwork, and when the project extends, it costs more money, and then which lead to lower profit margins. And if they move to another tiers of housing, they can make better profit. So that is one of the key reasons why they change this.
When I moved to Seattle in '97, it was quite a depressed economy, and it was kind of a sense of low self-esteem, and it's like, really not much happening. So the whole next 10 years was kind of focused on trying to get investments into the city, and some of the deeper pockets were critical in doing that. And at that time, I might have said to a housing advocacy group that if you build enough housing, the prices will drop, because that's what we were taught in urban economics, supply and demand. And I recounted that without actually having any life experience or real data to support that. I was just recounting urban theory. And 15 years later, that didn't happen, because we found that as soon as you build housing, first of all, it's very tough to get developers to focus on affordable housing. They want to, if they are in the free market, they want to build the most expensive housing because it's the greatest rate of return for them, and it's easier to get financing, and it's much faster process. So moment housing was being developed, it was being, taken up by the investor community. And I'm not talking about large investment corporations or banks. These are like private individuals who are buying up one or two properties as investments for the future. So if housing was being made available, at that time it was quite affordable, 15 years ago, it was being taken away from the market and being put into the rental market. So that, and then what we noticed is the prices didn't drop. because what the real, and other than the developers, what the realtors and all the other players in the development market saw, that they can raise the price of the property to any limit and there is a buyer, because at that time the wealth in Seattle grew exponentially. So I feel like one of the critical things that need to be done is for us theorists to really take a look at the urban theory that we teach in colleges around urban economics, and to really see if the words of wisdom from the 70s and 80s still hold muster. Because what we have found is the moment housing becomes a commodity, moment people invest in housing as investment rather than as a need, it totally distorts the market and it moves it aggressively away from affordability.
We've been working on a local project, and each and everything that the government does to step in actually creates an unintended obstacle. And once it does that, that then creates a delay and a cost, both related, which then ratchets up the price of poker each time, such that the costs all of a sudden start spiraling upward much faster than the provision can possibly happen, which is really bad, because I've also been all over the country, including very poor areas. And what happens then is that if you try to make sure it's a right without addressing all these things that happen at the same time, then you price it out of the ability for the local jurisdiction to do anything about it, because they can't maintain it. Because each time, if you're getting $200,000, say, for a house that's affordable, but it costs you, because of all these regulations, $800,000. This is actually what I heard from a friend in San Francisco. You're going to be losing $600,000 every house. And even though it may be a right, at some point it's going to add up so fast that the government then loses its power because it gets booted, and some other government comes in because it can't sustain that. So you're absolutely right. Each and everything that you do trying to make that right happen, you have to be so careful, because it ends up making a problem.
This is an interesting issue that Andrew is raising, I think, about whether defining a problem of housing, lack of housing, as a right is the smartest strategy. I think we understand the concern that why we don't want housing to be just like any other commodity. It's a basic needs of the people. But I think that defining something as a right allows people to be able to sue their government, saying, you are violating my rights, I don't have a housing. Have you heard of situations like that? No. So I feel like the rights is more of an argument that we make to make ourselves feel good, but I'm not sure how does it actually translate into public policy.
Mm-hmm.
A really interesting conversation. I think it taps into a couple of different things. One, New York City, and we do a lot of work with the mayor's office, and have been pretty lockstep with them on a lot of housing policy goals. We are one of the few right to shelter cities in the United States, one of the few right to shelter cities in the world, and where we've started to have challenges with this particular administration is that because of the current influx of asylum seekers and a migrant population that is coming in pretty massive numbers, that other places are seeing, the mayor's office is trying to back away from the right to shelter and actually trying to legally challenge it, because people are suing the city of New York because they aren't being sheltered, never mind housing. So the call for the issue of the right to shelter, I think, is a really important one. What a right to housing would potentially look like, I think, is really interesting. But I think part of the challenge there, and part of the important thing around that discourse as it exists thus far, is that you have to be careful about what that looks like in finite systems, whether it's a finite political system or a finite economic system, because ultimately, like any other right, it becomes an abstract concept that works at a much larger scale than just a finite political or economic system, and it becomes something else. And what that becomes, I think, is one of the things that makes it so interesting. I would, having worked in housing and housing policy for a long time, I teach actually at Columbia, and the way I often teach housing policy is it's often a series of issues that are kind of like, are we working toward shelter? Are we working toward housing? Are we working toward more units? Are we working toward quality of life issues with bigger units? Are we so there's almost there a series of different pairings where the economics around housing and housing delivery often work in where along the spectrum between those two poles do we land, and where does a particular government, culture, country, what have you, land. It might be interesting to try and set. You can almost have like like with the different papers that have been submitted, almost there's a series of planning lectures at Columbia's GSAP, where somebody will present their work, and then it's the job of the faculty to basically is like challenge that work, and it would be interesting if you took these papers and then have somebody challenge the premise of those papers. Yes. So the same way that we've got, some interesting work on right to housing, if somebody in this group here on this call said, okay, I'm going to write, 250 words about why this person's wrong, or why the right to housing maybe isn't the right idea. But because I think it's so easy to really simplify a conversation around housing to a bunch of, we should be doing this, we should be doing that, where housing is so complicated. It's important. I think it's be a more useful exercise for people to see both sides of each one of these issues.
Basic human needs: food, shelter, and clothing.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's where the shelter part stops. As long as you provide them shelter from the elements, you satisfy the basic requirement.
Right.
Okay. And that's where the expectations come in. There are some needs that people have to fulfill based on their income and their capabilities. But what we are trying to fulfill is their aspirations and their wants. Well, when they start comparing themselves with the Jonases who have it, who have got it made. Amadi lives in a $2 billion home. I can't compete with them, and I would never aspire to have something like that.
Continuing the conversation with Brian about the right of the housing as a right, I think something that and connecting to what Bish asked about how we disagree. First, I fully I'm a supporter of the right of housing, or the right to housing, but I think as planners we sometimes miss the legal aspect. So something that helps a lot is bringing lawyers to the team, because they can connect this right of housing to other elements of the law. Something very important is that the right to housing is a progressive right. It's not only the right to have like a physical space, but also ownership and the different types of ownership is very important, and that sometimes we as planners we don't fully address it because of our perhaps technical perspective rather than legal. That was one thing, and second thing. I think in the papers, something important we want to raise, at least from the Latin American context, and my fellow colleagues are here, is how to use the existing housing stock to improve affordability. And I think that's key. And if we relate that to the right to housing or housing, I think there's room for bigger and unexpected opportunities. So I wanted to make those 2 points: bring lawyers to the discussion and use existing stock.
My feeling is there's a part of the population that we may be aiming at that already has a home, some kind of home, and in Latin America that's mainly in informal settlements. So self-builders take the place they can and build the house they can, and those houses are by millions in Latin America. So it's a bit the lower income population, so a bit lower than the population that credits, for example, or loans may aim at. And for that, it is very important that the government can start or develop public policies to address that issue, because it has been proven that investing in improving those homes has a very interesting return on investment, right? So when governments invest in improving existing homes, energy is saved, and when energy is subsidized, then governments are saving money, families get sick less, or improving their health. Again, governments save money because lower income families always need to make use of the public health system. Same with preventing accidents, so making homes safer, and very, very importantly, the mitigation impact. So we need also to think of the impact on decarbonizing those homes, and that's creating a huge positive impact. My thoughts are we may connect this to housing as a right, or as we call it, fair housing, because it's not any housing, but making sure those homes are proper, correct, adequate, or fair. And we can see how some governments have taken that task seriously and have moved forward in investing in lower income homes and improving lower income homes. I feel other sectors of the population may need different solutions, or may be able to pay for different solutions. And luckily in Latin America, millions of families live under poverty and would need of the assistance of the state, or the welfare state, to improve their lives and their homes.
You know, we can look at some good examples that some of the writers wrote about. in terms of what other countries are doing. I know that what changed in India around the 1980s is to provide middle class housing. The government took on huge amount of social housing that served the middle class, and those were quite successful. I mean, New Delhi is basically built on those public housing that were, then bought by private individuals. But India doesn't have that many good examples of very low income public housing. They have failed, and I know I've done a lot of research on those and why they failed. But I don't think we can just outright say no to public housing. I think the response in my case would be yes, but dash, 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 and to fill in what those other criteria are that would need to go hand in hand with public housing for it to be a tenable solution.
We might find ourselves needing to define what we mean by social housing. Just in the last 5 minutes of conversation, we've kind of through 4 or 5 different folks used 4 or 5 different housing typologies from a financing standpoint to describe social housing. So public housing, at least social housing, is not a term that's used much in the United States to describe public subsidy in housing. Public housing is often described and defined as housing that is paid for, built by, and managed by the federal government. And that has a tremendous amount of detractors and all sorts of challenges to it, which we could go into. We could write volumes and have multiple essays on what works about it and what doesn't work about it. But I think the way that it was originally suggested is kind of like a Keynesian economic model of you've got a free market system that needs safety valves and public investment at the government level in housing, that for the percentage or the part of the population whose needs are not being met by the housing market, if that's how we're kind of defining social housing, I think it would be a really interesting argument, but quite frankly, I would just be floored if anyone would, with a straight face, be able to say that we could just run we can run the housing market in a kind of a Friedman way, where you just you get rid of all subsidy, get rid of all regulation, and hope the market provides. But it would be a fascinating argument if you could have if you have those 2 poles.
But now I see the benefit of talking about different perspectives on how public housing has been implemented and evolved over the years in different regions. We tend to copy each other normally in different ways that we have confronted this issue. But the truth of the matter is that in many poor countries, also our governments don't have enough resources dedicated to really claim that public housing has made a difference as far as really tackling the gap between the need of those that cannot afford a house and the size of the programs and the financing behind them. So what we concluded, at least in our country, is that historically we never went beyond pilot projects. The size and the amount of resources dedicated to public housing will never be of the size of the problem that we have. So therefore, we have to really become more innovative when we approach this issue and look at actually how we can help the families to build more resilient economies. And as you know, in Latin America, there is millions of families living in squatter settlements. The squatter settlements over the time had become actually a kind of working class neighborhoods that had improved themselves. And they have their own specific challenges. in the past, there was an idea at some point that somebody thought that we could eradicate squatter settlement. But on the contrary, what had happened is that this is a private production of low-income families that had over many years mature and become neighborhoods. So, and that it's hard to tell that government can claim any significant influence on improving them, except by some policy or some kind of level of recognizing them as an existing phenomenon. But I agree that it will be very interesting to hear the experiences from different countries and compare our notes regarding this issue.
Comparison between different governments, different municipalities, and what those governments and those municipalities, those communities, those cultures see as the government's role and responsibility to provide housing, and for whom. Because I think that's something that, you know, which kind of goes back to what you were saying about, are we in agreement that, you know, we're kind of for social housing? Maybe the question is, you know, what are the similarities, what are the comparisons, what are the contrasts between all these different governments, all these different countries, and what the government's perceived role and responsibility is in helping to provide housing. And maybe, you know, some governments are like, it's not our problem. That's not our job. And other governments feel like that's a huge part of their job.
We say in our work around equity is, you know, if you're not paying to house somebody, you're paying to police that person. So, and there are some very interesting authors who've actually researched that in terms of how much it costs the government, the local government, state government, to manage their unhoused and homeless population versus actually how much it would cost to house them. And that's why a lot of states like Utah and Salt Lake City provide free housing for those who are homeless, because it just costs them less. And they find that under secure environments, those people very quickly, than the homeless, become reintegrated into the community. So no one talks about those success stories, but there are a lot of success stories where government interventions have helped people turn their lives around. But obviously it has to be the right government and the right people in the government to make those programs successful. I remember that, you know, in the 80s, when I would talk about housing and so on and so forth, I was told that there was tax incentives in America for a second house. If you bought a second house, you actually got a tax write-off. So there were incentives for people to invest in more than one house. And I'm trying to figure out, there was some tax changes made in 2019, but I have to read that in detail to see if it actually addresses this one issue. But that would be, I mean, for me, if I was, you know, if I was a president, that's probably the first thing I would take a look at is, do we still need that, where we encourage people to, through tax incentives, to buy a second property? Or maybe we, you know, float that once everybody in the country is housed. You know, once housing has been solved, then we could say, okay, now we can provide some incentives for a second house. So those are some, you know, policies that we've just taken for granted. But, you know, there's really a lot of opportunity to go through all these incentives, whether it's at the local tax level, it's a federal tax level, you know, land use code. I mean, all the policies that we just have taken for granted, I think.
The single largest subsidy that the U.S. federal government gives for housing is the Mortgage Interest Deduction Act.
Yes.
So it by orders of 50, 60 times more than what the public or what the federal government spends on tax credits for affordable housing, on public housing, on all the other programs combined. The biggest one is for people to buy their own houses. I don't know about the second home one, but that's like when we talk about social housing and the government's role, that's a huge financial outlay by the U.S. federal government, is to keep people in their homes.
And maybe we could be very specific. Like for us, our policy now focus on making a difference between the quantitative deficit and the qualitative deficit, because for us, we recognize that we have an issue with the squatter settlement that is reflected in a qualitative deficit. But when we do census, everybody lives in a home, but whether that home is appropriate to the needs, that's what was not always captured in the data. And that's what we are now focusing. We realize that probably everybody has a place to live in, but they don't have is a place that is healthy. And also, I think we as planners should also have more of a more comprehensive view of what I think this housing that is about, because for many years, we also built a lot of homes far away from services. And what I've seen is that normally squatter settlements are a response to strategic locations in the city, being closer to the principal access with the principal infrastructure, such as employment centers, main roads, main schools, parks, and other areas that may not be accessible in the affordable housing project did in the past, far away from all the elements of life. So a home is more than just a place to live in, but it's a kind of your location from where you operate. So I think it also takes how we have seen the failure of a lot of these policies projects because they were not part of building the city and the right to the city.
Informal settlements, which many of our fellows actually wrote about, because that's one of the major, most cities, 60-70% of the people live in these informal settlements. So what do we have a position on what to do with informal settlements? Because there has been a policy since 1970 of upgrading these informal settlements, bringing in services gradually, right? And some people think that has not worked. Others think that it has worked. What is our collective judgment on those past policies that were done? There was at least 50 years of policies on informal settlements I can think of, right? Has the informal settlements done better because they've been defined as rights, or is it because there's this pressure for services, water, electricity, basic things that government can bring in step by step? They don't have the money to bring everything together. But I want some of my fellows I know wrote on that informal settlements. I don't want to lose that as a topic. I think it should be an important topic to respond to.
It's especially coming from MIT, because it's the home of John F.C. Turner. That's where he wrote his most important works on informal settlements. So
I know, and we miss him, right? We just lost him. He just like 2 or 3 months back. But there was a whole bunch of stuff written at that time in the 60s now when he wrote. And now 50 years later, 60 years later, if somebody asks us, so what's your new knowledge about informal settlements?
That could be fascinating. The housing as a verb 50 years later. And because it all focused on the idea of informal settlements and what the government's role is in that, and what regulations role is in that, and design and planning and blah 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 blah. But there's such a rich history there that, and I'd forgotten that we're like at plus 50 right now. It could be, especially since as you say we just lost him. That could be a really fascinating focus. And it is also something, even in New York City, Seattle right now has a huge informal settlement population. Los Angeles is working to deal with their huge informal settlement population. And New York City, part of its right to shelter, if it loses the right to shelter, will have a huge informal settlement population. So it's not just an international. It could be a there could be, every single country. I think it could be really interesting to look across lots of different places to see what that looks like.
Yeah, that will be. Somebody raised the issue of sweat equity, which was a key issue in the 60s. I think it was Krishna who raised the issue. But Brian, that when Turner, etc., were writing, they were extremely critical of public housing.
Yeah.
And it was reaction to that, saying public housing doesn't work, it hasn't produced enough housing, and that's why people have to find their own, right? Neither the market has provided nor the state. So it was a very interesting starting point, and I don't know, after 50 years, do we believe in that or do we change our views?